Hello, chefs. Today we're talking about umami, the fifth basic taste, what it is, and how to use it with purpose and intention. I am Mark Grigsby, your chef and guide through this experience, and this is the IncrEDIBLE Discourse.
All systems go.
All right, welcome to the show, episode 5 of season 2. Super excited about this show today. We're going to be exploring umami. But before we get into that, as usual, I hope that you guys checked out the bonus episode last week and enjoyed it. I wanted those episodes to truly be that, a bonus for all of you. I have them every couple of months as a sprinkle of extra content for you guys to listen to. Anyhow, check them out if you haven't already, and remember to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss the little things like the bonus episodes, right? Bonus episode releases, merchandise releases, downloadable resource uploads, and all of the little things that we do here on the IncrEDIBLE Discourse to help you become the absolute best cook or chef you can be. Now, let's talk food. So, umami is often treated like a mystery ingredient, something exotic or something technical or reserved for chefs who speak in ratios and Latin names. But the truth is, umami isn't a trick, and it isn't new. It's one of the most universal flavor principles in cooking, showing up anywhere patience, time, and intention are respected. From a traditional Japanese dashi simmered with kombu to a tray of vegetables slowly roasting in the oven, umami is what makes food feel complete. It's not loud. It doesn't hit you all at once. It lingers. It rounds the edges. And when it's missing, you feel it, even if you can't explain why. In this episode, we're stripping down umami to what it really is, not MSG myths, not chef buzzwords, just a clear understanding of where umami comes from, how it develops, and how to use it with purpose instead of excess. Because umami isn't about dumping soy sauce into everything or chasing savory until food becomes heavy and muddy. It's about recognizing depth, building it early, and knowing when enough is enough. Whether you're cooking at home or running a professional kitchen, umami teaches one same lesson. Great flavor is rarely added at the end. It's developed from the very first decision you make. We'll talk about the science without getting lost in it, the tradition without romanticizing it, and the technique without turning it into a shortcut. You'll learn how to spot umami in everyday ingredients and how to build it naturally through cooking methods you already use, and how to avoid the common mistakes that flatten food instead of elevating it. Because once you understand umami, you stop chasing flavor and you start controlling it. So now that we've kind of framed what umami is, and maybe more importantly, what it's not, let's slow things down and really understand why this fifth taste matters. Because once you understand umami at a foundational level, it changes how you season, how you cook, and how you taste food. Not in a flashy way, but in a quiet, confident kind of way. The kind of confidence that shows up when food just works. At its core, umami is a taste, yeah? Just like sweet and salty, sour and bitter. It's not a seasoning and it's not a sauce, and it's definitely not a shortcut. Umami is driven by naturally occurring compounds, primarily glutamates and nucleotides that exist in foods all over the world. Tomatoes, mushrooms, aged cheeses, cured meats, seaweed, long-cooked stocks. None of these things are new. None of them are trendy. They've been part of human cooking for centuries because they satisfy something deep in our palate. Umami tells your brain, this is nourishing. This is complete. This food is worth paying attention to. And that's the key difference. Umami doesn't hit you the way salt does. Salt is immediate. Salt is sharp. It announces itself. Umami doesn't do that. Umami creates roundness. It creates length. It creates that feeling where a bite doesn't just taste good in the moment. It stays with you for a second after you swallow. And that lingering satisfaction is umami doing its job. It's why a simple broth can feel comforting. It's why a sauce can taste finished without being super heavy, right? It's why some dishes feel flat even when they're seasoned properly. And this is also where people get it confused, because umami is often mistaken for saltiness or richness, but they're not the same thing. Salt enhances the flavor, fat carries the flavor, acid sharpens the flavor, but umami deepens it. Think of salt as turning the volume knob up, or acid bringing clarity and focus, and fat giving weight and mouthfeel. But umami adds depth. If salt is the punchline, umami is the backstory. Without it, food can taste one-dimensional. With too much of it, food becomes muddy and overwhelming. What makes umami especially powerful is how it interacts with the other tastes. Umami amplifies salt without actually adding sodium. It makes fat feel more luxurious without making a dish feel greasy. And when balanced correctly with acidity, it creates contrast, richness without heaviness, savoriness without fatigue. This is why dishes with strong umami often need acid to stay balanced. Think like tomato-based sauces, mushroom ragus, long braised meats. Without acidity, they feel heavy, but with it, they feel alive. Historically, umami wasn't always named, but it was always understood. In the early 1900s, Japanese scientist Kukune Ikeda identified umami as a distinct taste while studying kombu. And if you're not familiar with kombu, it's a type of seaweed used to make dashi. But this man noticed that the savoriness of kombu wasn't sweet, salty, sour, or bitter. It was something else entirely. And he called it umami, which loosely translates to pleasant, savory taste. But while the word was new, the concept wasn't. Cultures around the world had already been building umami into their cooking through aging, fermentation, curing, and slow cooking. And dashi is a perfect example. It's simple: water, kombu, and sometimes bonito. But it's loaded with natural glutamates. Aged cheeses like Parmesan or another one. When you go over time, these proteins break down and they release amino acids that create that deep, savory character. Cured meats rely on the same principle. Fermentation, aging, and time all unlock umami. Not because something is being added, but because something is being revealed. Modern kitchens understand this more clearly now. We talk about fermentation and the Maillard reactions and reduction and browning, but all of these processes are just different ways of developing umami. When you roast vegetables instead of steaming them, you're concentrating sugars and breaking down proteins. When you brown tomato paste instead of adding it raw, you're transforming sharp acidity into depth. When you reduce a sauce, you're not just thickening it, you're intensifying the compounds that give it character. And you see this most clearly in real-world cooking. Let's take tomatoes, for example, right? Raw tomatoes are bright, acidic, and fresh. If you cook them slowly, something changes. The acidity softens, the sugars concentrate, the glutamates become more pronounced, and suddenly, the tomato isn't just sharp, it's savory. That's umami developing through heat and time. The same thing happens with mushrooms. Raw mushrooms are very mild and maybe even a little bland, I guess you could say. But if you roast them hard, drive off all that moisture and allow browning to happen, and now they're deeply savory, almost like meaty, without a single animal product involved. One of my favorite professional examples is the Parmesan rind. On its own, it's not something you just snack on. Who the fuck eats Parmesan rinds, right? It's weird. But if you drop it into a pot of stock or a simmering sauce, and then it transforms the entire thing, it doesn't make the dish taste like cheese. It makes it taste finished, fuller, more complete. And that's umami working quietly in the background. Same thing goes for long simmered sauces. A properly developed sauce doesn't rely on salt to taste good. It tastes good because time did the work. This is why patience matters so much when we talk about umami, because you can't rush it without consequences. And sure, there are shortcuts that exist, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, but they come with a lot of trade-offs. True umami rewards restraint. It asks you to trust the process. It asks you to taste, adjust, and stop when the dish is telling you it's ready. And that's a skill. That's not an instinct. That's experience. Understanding umami at this level changes how you cook. You stop asking, what can I add? And start asking, what can I develop? You start thinking earlier in the process. You respect time. You respect heat. You respect balance. And once all of that happens, seasoning becomes less reactive and more intentional. Food stops being loud. It starts being confident. And this is the foundation we're going to build on today, because umami isn't about making food taste stronger. It's about making it taste deeper. And so this lesson came the hard way for me early on in my career, when I thought depth meant more flavor, more punch, more savory. And I was cooking with confidence I hadn't yet earned. And I was convinced that if a dish didn't immediately grab you, it just wasn't good enough. So I started stacking what I now call savory bombs. You know, things like anchovy, soy sauce, Parmesan, reduced stock, all in the same dish like a mad scientist. On paper, it made sense. Each one worked on its own. But together, it was a mess. So I remember plating this dish up and then tasting it and thinking, oh, wow, damn, this is pretty intense. And for about 2 seconds, I was so proud of that. I had my chest popped out and I was the man. But then the second bite hit, and then the third, and suddenly the dish wasn't exciting anymore. It was exhausting. It was heavy. It was muddy. There was no lift, no contrast, no clarity. Everything tasted the same, just louder and intense. I hadn't built the depth. I had buried all of it underneath the dish. And what made it worse was that I couldn't immediately explain why this didn't work. Technically, nothing was wrong with it. It was seasoned, it was rich, it was cooked properly, but it wasn't refined. It didn't have intention. I had treated umami like seasoning instead of structure, like something you add instead of something you develop. And the food told me that immediately. And that moment forced me to slow down and really listen to what the dish was asking for, not what my ego wanted it to be. I started paying attention to how umami behaves instead of just chasing it. And I noticed that the best dishes weren't the ones where you could point to the savory element and say, boy, that's it. They were the ones you couldn't identify at all. You just knew the food felt complete. And that's when it clicked for me. Umami isn't supposed to stand in the spotlight. It's not meant to announce itself. It's there to support everything else, to give structure, to create balance, to make the other flavors feel intentional instead of accidental. When umami is used correctly, you don't notice it. You notice the absence of struggle within the different flavors of food. And that lesson reshaped how I cook to this day. Now, when I reach for anchovy or aged cheese or a fermented ingredient, I ask myself one question. What exactly am I adding and what is it supporting? If I can taste it clearly, I've probably gone too far. Because the goal isn't to impress someone with how savory a dish is, it's to make them want another bite without knowing exactly why. Umami should support the dish, not announce itself. And if there's one thing I want you to take out of this last segment, it's this. Umami isn't about doing more, it's about doing things earlier and with intention. And that idea matters even more when we move out of this professional setting and into the home setting. Because most home cooks aren't struggling with access to ingredients or fancy equipment. They're struggling with timing, confidence, and knowing where flavor actually comes from. And with that idea, it's time to move into the home kitchen. And you know what that means. It's time for
Food for Thought.
Now let's talk about what this looks like at home, practically, realistically, without overcomplicating your cooking. The biggest shift I want home cooks to make with umami is choose one primary umami source per dish. Just one. Not three, not a backup plan. One clear driver of depth. That might be tomatoes. Might be mushrooms. It might be aged cheese, anchovy, or maybe it's a fermented ingredient. But once you pick it, commit to developing it properly instead of stacking more on top of it because you're fucking insecure. Because this is where people get into trouble. They'll start a dish with tomato paste and then add soy sauce because it tastes flat, and then finish with Parmesan because it still doesn't feel right. The instinct makes sense. You're trying to fix something, but what's usually missing isn't another ingredient. It's time, or heat, or restraint. When you choose one umami source and give it the conditions it needs to shine, the dish almost always comes together cleaner and more balanced. And that brings us to timing. Because umami wants to be built early and adjusted late. And this is one of the most important concepts in this entire episode. If you wait until the end of cooking to add umami, you're not developing depth. You're just slathering and pasting the shit on. And that's how food ends up tasting salty, heavy, or oddly fucking disconnected, right? Instead, introduce your umami early enough that it has time to change, time to soften, time to integrate, time to become part of the dish instead of sitting on the top. Cooking method plays a huge role here. Roasting versus steaming is a perfect example because steaming preserves freshness, yes, but it doesn't create depth. Roasting drives off moisture, concentrates flavor, and encourages browning. All of those things amplify umami. The same vegetable cooked two different ways can taste like completely different ingredients. If your goal is savoriness, dry heat will always be your best friend. Reducing versus thickening is another big one. Like two best friends, I guess, right? As thickening with starch might change the texture and thicken it up and get you where you're going, but it doesn't deepen the flavor. Reducing removes the water and concentrates what's already there. When you reduce a sauce, you're intensifying the natural glutamates that create umami. That's why a reduced stock tastes richer without needing more salt. It's also why sauces that rely too heavily on thickeners can feel dull or pasty or gross. They've skipped that important development stage. Browning before deglazing is one of the simplest and most effective umami builders available to all home cooks. When you brown meat or vegetables or even tomato paste, you're creating flavor compounds that simply don't exist otherwise. Deglazing afterwards captures that depth and distributes it throughout the entire dish. If you skip the browning, and no amount of seasoning at the end is going to fully make up for it. So Let's talk about common mistakes then, right? Because most umami problems at home come from the same handful of habits, right? So here's one. Overusing soy sauce, miso, or fish sauce is at the very top of this list because these ingredients are powerful and they're easy to reach for because they work super fast. But fast doesn't mean correct. When they're used as a fix instead of a foundation, they overpower everything else. The dish stops tasting layered and starts tasting fucking generic. Another big mistake is confusing saltiness for savoriness. If food tastes flat, adding salt is usually the first move. And sometimes that's the right move, yes, but if salt doesn't fix the problem, adding more fucking salt isn't going to make it better. That's usually a sign that the dish lacks depth, not seasoning. This is where a small amount of umami added earlier in that process would have done more than a heavy hand of salt. Adding umami at the very end is another trap. Don't sprinkle cheese and splashing soy sauce or stirring miso right before. It can make it taste aggressive instead of cohesive. Because umami needs time to mellow and integrate. When it doesn't get that time, it dominates instead of supports. The good news is that home cooks already have incredible umami tools at their disposal. They just don't always use them intentionally. Tomato paste is a perfect example. Used raw, it's sharp and acidic. Cooked out properly until it darkens and smells sweet, it becomes deeply savory, right? That transformation is umami being developed, not added. Dried mushrooms are another powerhouse. A small handful rehydrated and chopped can change an entire dish. The soaking liquid alone can add depths to soups, sauces, grains, like dried mushrooms. Try it. Anchovy paste, when used correctly, shouldn't taste like anchovy at all. It should disappear into the background and make everything else taste more complete. If you can identify it clearly, you have used too much, specifically anchovy paste, right? Hard cheeses like Parmesan or Pecorino should be accents, not crutches. A rind simmered in a pot does more for depth than a heavy-handed finishing grate. When cheese is doing all the work, it usually means something earlier was rushed. The goal here isn't to turn your kitchen into a laboratory or your cooking into a science project. It's to cook with intention. To understand that umami rewards patience, not panic. When you stop chasing flavor at the end and start building it from the beginning, cooking becomes calmer, becomes more predictable, more satisfying. And that's where confidence comes from. Not from adding more shit, but from knowing when to stop. And so now it's time to lock this idea in. And so here's your quick fix of the week.
Pro tips from the chef's list.
Let's make this practical. Like, do this right now practical. Here's the moment almost every home cook recognizes. You taste the dish, something feels flat, so you add salt. You taste it again, it's still flat. You add more salt. Now it's fucking salty, and it's still fucking flat. At that point, most people think the dish is ruined, but it's not. You've just been treating the symptom instead of the cause. When salt doesn't fix the problem isn't seasoning, it's depth. So here's the direct action. Stop adding salt. Step back and ask yourself one question. What did I give this dish time to become? If you tell yourself not much, that's your fix. Go back to the pan and introduce one small umami builder, early enough that it can actually change and integrate. A tablespoon of tomato paste cooked out until it darkens and smells sweet. A handful of chopped mushrooms sauteed until their moisture is gone and they start to brown. A Parmesan rind dropped into a simmering pot and just left alone to do its work. Not a splash, not a sprinkle, something that can integrate into what you're cooking. And then this is the part that matters. Let it fucking cook. Give it 5 minutes, 10 if it needs it, but don't rush to judgment. Taste again after the umami has had time to soften and spread. 9 times out of 10, you're going to notice that the dish suddenly feels fuller, rounder, more complete, without being louder. Now rebalance. This is where acidity comes in. A small squeeze of lemon, a splash of vinegar, a spoon of wine reduced properly. Acid doesn't add depth, but it reveals it. It sharpens the edges so umami doesn't feel heavy. This is the step that turns better into right. And only after you do that, reassess the salt. And here's the thing, most of the time, you'll need less of it than you thought, because depth amplifies the seasoning. Salt works best when it has something to stand on. This isn't a theory, it's a repeatable fix. The next time food tastes flat, don't reach for more salt out of habit. Reach for development. Build something into the dish. Give it time. Then bring it back into balance. If salt isn't fixing it, depth is always what's missing. Once you understand how to build umami intentionally at home, the professional kitchen is where that discipline really gets tested. Because in a pro environment, umami isn't about one dish tasting good. It's about every dish tasting right, every night, under pressure, with different hands touching the food. That's where control, consistency, and systems stop being buzzwords and start being survival skills. Because in a restaurant, you don't get the luxury of cooking by feel alone. You don't get to reinvent the wheel every service. Guests expect the dish they loved last week to taste exactly the same tonight. Not close, not in the same family, the same ballpark. And that's why umami can't live in shortcuts. It has to live inside the seasoning system. It has to be planned, measured, trained, and then repeated. It can't be improvised during service when adrenaline is high and judgment gets fucking weird and shaky. When umami is treated like a last-second fix, that's when kitchens lose control. Flavors drift. Sauces get heavier as the night goes on, and one cook leans on salt and another leans on cheese and another adds a splash of something fermented because it needs something. Suddenly, the dish has no center. And that's not creativity, that's erosion. Identity disappears one plate at a time. So instead, umami gets built into the foundation, in the stocks, the mother sauces, the braising liquids, the purees, the bases, components that are made the same way every time and taught the same way to every cook. When umami lives there, seasoning during service becomes refinement, not a rescue. Stock building is the clearest and most unforgiving example of all of this. A good stock is never just bones and water, it's deliberate construction. Roasted bones or vegetables to create that depth. Aromatics added at the right time for structure and not sweetness. Mushroom trim for background savoriness. Tomato scraps for roundness. Cheese rides for length. None of it at random. None of it thrown in because it's available. Every addition has a reason. And when that stock is built correctly, it carries so much natural savoriness that everything downstream becomes easier. Sauces need less reduction. Seasoning becomes subtle instead of aggressive. Acid can be used thoughtfully instead of desperately. You're not chasing flavor anymore. You're now managing it. And that difference shows up immediately on the plate. One of the hardest skills to teach in a professional kitchen is knowing when to stop. And most young cooks don't struggle with effort. They struggle with restraint. They've been taught to impress, to punch flavor, to go big. So they add and add and add and add and add and add, and fuck me. Leadership means retraining that instinct, teaching cooks what enough actually tastes like before heaviness sits in. That often means pulling a sauce off the heat when it still feels like it wants something and asking, what happens if we stop right now? It means tasting with intention, not confirmation. Because once umami crosses the line, it tips from depth to density, and there's no fixing that. You can try to mask it, but you can't undo it. And in a restaurant setting, masking problems is fucking expensive. And this is also where acid stops being optional. In professional kitchens, acid isn't a garnish, it's structure. It's the counterweight that keeps savory food from becoming exhausting. Lemon juice, vinegar, wine reductions, these aren't last-minute splashes. They're built into the recipes. They're tested, they're adjusted, and then they're protected. Every umami-driven dish needs a release valve, something that lifts the palate and resets it for the next bite. Without that, guests get full faster, fatigue sets in, and the dish that should feel luxurious starts feeling heavy. So, systems and ratios are kind of what make all of this repeatable. Batch sauces are built around one clear umami driver, not a pile of them. Mushroom sauces lean fully into mushrooms. Tomato sauces commit to tomato. Meat sauces rely on bones, collagen, and reduction. When you stack drivers, clarity disappears. When you commit to just one, the identity strengthens. And that identity is what cooks can be trained to protect. Trim management becomes strategy at this point, not waste. Mushroom stems aren't scraps, they're stock ingredients. Cheese rinds aren't trash, they're depth. Bones, vegetable peelings, herb stems, all categorized, labeled, and then repurposed with intention. And here's the key. Not everything goes into everything, and that discipline matters. Mushroom trim, again, supports mushroom-forward preparations. Vegetable scraps support vegetable stocks. When prep stays consistent, flavor stays consistent. When prep drifts, flavor drifts. And guests notice that long before management does. Modern kitchens have expanded the umami toolkit, but the philosophy hasn't changed. Controlled fermentation allows chefs to build depth without relying on animal products. Kombu and seaweed have moved far beyond traditional Japanese applications and into global cooking. Not as flavor signatures, but as quiet structural ingredients. When used correctly, they don't make food taste Asian, whatever the fuck that is. They make food taste complete. Plant-forward kitchens rely heavily on these strategies because umami becomes the bridge between satisfaction and sustainability. When depth is built correctly, you don't miss the protein. You don't chase the richness. The food stands on its own. And again, restraint is everything. Fermentation doesn't mean funk for the fucking sake of funk. Seaweed doesn't mean the ocean on the plate. These tools should disappear into the dish. The moment you can clearly identify them, balance has already been lost. And waste control is where umami quietly becomes a cost control weapon. Scraps that become stocks reduce purchasing. Depth replaces expensive ingredients instead of stacking on top of them. That's not romantic, that's operational reality. Kitchens that understand umami don't throw away flavor, they extract it. And when done correctly, both food cost and quality improve at the same time. At scale, umami is really about respect for ingredients, for systems, and for the people cooking the food. It's understanding that great flavor isn't an accident, and it's never random. It's designed. It's trained, it's protected, and then it's reinforced every single day, every single service. Because in the professional kitchen, umami isn't about impressing anyone. It's about consistency under pressure, right? And that's where mastery actually shows up. So here's how I want you to actually use this on the line, guys. Not as a slogan, not as a philosophy, but as a repeatable act you can train into all of the cooks. Stop asking, is it flavorful enough? That question leads to intensity. Intensity leads to over-seasoning. Instead, train all your cooks to ask one better question. What does the flavor do after I swallow? That's where umami lives. Not in the first hit, not in the salt spike, in the finish. And here's the action. When a sauce, soup, or braise is close to done, have your cook taste a single spoonful. No bread, no garnish, no distraction. Taste it, swallow it, and wait a full 5 seconds. Not 2, not a half beat, 5 whole seconds. If the flavor collapses immediately, the dish lacks depth. If it lingers but feels heavy, umami has gone too far. If it hangs around quietly and invites another bite, you're kind of in the right zone. And now you'll reinforce this in training. Don't let cooks taste 3 times in a row without pausing. Rapid tasting trains intensity. Delayed tasting trains awareness. Build that pause into your culture. Call it out. Protect it. Because once cooks learn to taste for length, they stop reaching for salt or cheese or fermented ingredients out of panic. They start adjusting with intention instead. The next step, pair that tasting drill with acid control. If a dish has length but feels tiring, add acid in micro adjustments, a few drops at a time. Then taste, swallow, and wait. Acid shouldn't erase the umami, it should sharpen it. If acid makes the dish feel clearer without making it thinner, you've balanced it correctly. If it wipes the dish out, you've gone too far. And this is how you keep food from drifting during service. This is how the first plate and the last plate match. This is how you stop cooks from cooking louder as the night gets more difficult. Make this part of your pre-service conversation. Not every day, not as a lecture, as a standard. Because when cooks learn to taste for length instead of intensity, restraint becomes instinct, not instruction. And that's where professional seasoning actually lives. Today's final thought leads us to this. Umami isn't magic. It's patience made visible. It's what shows up when you stop rushing, stop stacking, and trying to impress the plate instead of respecting it. When you slow down, when you build intentionally, and when you actually taste with awareness, food changes. Not because you added something special at the end, but because you gave it the time and space to become what it was supposed to be from the start. That's really what this episode has been all about. Because umami isn't a trick ingredient or a secret weapon. It's the result of good decisions made early and then reinforced all the way through the process. It lives in roasting instead of steaming, in reducing instead of thickening, in building layers instead of piling them on. It rewards restraint and punishes panic. And it never responds well to shortcuts taken out of insecurity. Whether you're cooking at home or running a professional kitchen, the lesson is the same here. Depth doesn't come from doing more. It comes from doing fewer things with intention. It's my favorite word, intention. You hear me say that all throughout the show, every episode, right? Because when you understand umami, you stop chasing flavor and you start managing it. You trust the process. You trust your palate. And most importantly, you trust yourself enough to stop before the dish crosses the line. The best food doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hit you over the head. It invites you in. It holds your attention without demanding it. You take a bite, you swallow, and you pause. Not because the flavor was loud, but because it stayed with you. That lingering moment is where umami lives. That's where satisfaction comes from. That's where mastery starts to show. So, the next time you're cooking something and it feels off, don't ask what you can add, ask what you can develop. Ask what needs more time. Ask what needs less. Because when you cook with awareness instead of urgency, food stops being chaotic and starts being complete. Great flavor doesn't shout, it lingers. And that's the standard we're chasing here. Quietly, intentionally, one decision at a time. So, the next time on the Incredible Discourse, we'll be sitting down with Chef James Versfeld, a seasoned executive chef whose work across hotels, restaurants, and major venues, from championship arenas to high-volume kitchens, gives him a rare perspective on flavor, pressure, and consistency at scale. Whether he's talking about developing culinary programs in fast-paced environments or balancing innovation with reliability, Chef James brings a depth of experience that challenges how we think about taste under fire and how systems shape success in professional kitchens. You're not going to want to miss this. You're not going to want to miss his insights on leadership, flavor, philosophy, and what it takes to really build memorable food that performs every single service. But before that conversation drops, don't forget the ways you can stay connected and get more out of every episode of the Incredible Discourse. Share your thoughts and favorite takeaways on social media using the hashtag #TheIncredibleDiscourse. And tell us how umami has changed the way you cook. Our community is where great questions turn into better kitchens. And if you haven't yet, make sure you're subscribed on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music so you never miss an episode, a training clip, or a pro tip. Head over to the website for show notes and blogs that dig deeper into every topic, and downloadable guides, including today's that's titled The Umami Field Guide, Unlocking the Science of Savory, that helps you turn these conversations into repeatable habits in your own kitchen. And if you're looking for gear that represents the craft and the conversation, we've got merch you'll actually wear. It's comfortable, it's chef approved, and designed by Board Games Apparel to remind you that mastery is about intention, not accident. Like my shirt? Like my shirt? You can't see my shirt, but that's Board Games Apparel right there. Whether you're a home cook leveling up or a pro chasing consistency, we've built this entire space for you. One episode, one idea, one intentional decision at a time. Stay curious and stay disciplined. I am Mark Grigsby, and this has been another amazing episode of the Incredible Discourse. See you next time.